loud, and I'm counting to three. 1, 2, 3. Hi. As always, I am Andrea Goeglein, but with me today is the author of The Fun Habit, Mike Rucker. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to see you again.
Thank you. And I love that we're actually on opposite sides of the United States, so we get to experience the world from many different ways. But Mike, I want you to know, I invited you here today to give our audience just 3 tips on how to bring the fun habit to work. But before that, I want them to know why I was so attracted to you, the book, your work, all of those great things. When I read back in your bio, I walked away and I said that I felt that Mike was the intersection of entrepreneurship, mental health, positive psychology, and physical fitness. Like, you took a lifetime of education and experience and wrapped it into some of the most current ways of being to be successful. Is that a fair?
It's a very kind. We need to spend more time together. You can say no, but I think that's right. I mean, I took an interest initially in cognitive science and peak performance.
Yep.
And certainly, part of my backstory is really getting involved with the quantified self movement. You know that
Yep.
I lived in the Bay Area for quite some time. And so, I was really keen on optimization, especially in my 30s. But then I saw the ill effects of a lot of that, especially if you overemphasize on it. The book itself, The Fun Habit, is about kind of trying to optimize for happiness, and how we know now, here in 2020, that folks that go down that path, it's actually ill-fated and can lead to real clinical outcomes, right? Negative clinical outcomes. So yeah, my path, with regards to how can I maximize my impact and wellness, it has been a passion project, but it's taken many turns.
It sure has. But what I really appreciate about, your book is that it really individualized. Like, we are way past 2020. And we're now really trying to maneuver, how do I really want to work in the world? How do I want to maintain my health as I work in the world? How does this all work together? And I feel that you've done it in this book in such a beautiful way, because you're giving the individual a lot of power. So before I say too much about why I'm excited, I want you, there is chapter 9 for everybody who gets the book. Bring your fun habit to work. Tell us 3 ways, whether I am a person like myself who works in my own environment, or I do it half and half, hybrid, or I am required to go to work every day. 3 things that you would suggest.
Yeah, so I'll try to make them applicable for both individuals that are trying to do that, and potentially things that leaders can look for.
Right.
The main construct of the book is agency and autonomy, because once you command those, right, you really can be more deliberate about how you spend your time. We call that time affluence, and most people that are familiar with positive psychology understand that concept. And so bringing your fun habit to work is, how can I use those constructs effectively? So first and foremost, looking at how you spend your time involved in work, and taking back ownership of that. So whether that's looking at the activities that you do and being mindful of them, like, I just don't like doing this, but is there perhaps a better way to do it? Or, so I generally look at 3 different constructs. Is it the activity itself? So is it the way I'm doing it? Is it the people that I'm with? Which, I get can get messy, but it's still important, right? If you spend a whole year with folks that you just don't like, maybe there's more important questions. And then something that's more accessible to most, is it the environment, right? I think for a lot of us, coming out of the pandemic, we realized, like, wow, I really like being in a coffee shop rather than, within the 4 walls of my office, because, of all of the environmental friction that can come from working at home. So looking at those 3 things can be important, but the main construct is, how can you own your time, right? then it's looking at the construct of variety, right? So if you're a leader, are you offering options, for folks to enjoy themselves? So at the enterprise level, right, what are the amenities that you're offering instead of dictating them, right? Like, in the book, I joke about Crazy Sock Day.
Uh-huh.
What can you do? Where I've seen the most success as a researcher is folks that create affinity groups, because there's a lot of pressure and leverage dynamics when you're
And
within
would
your.
you, I know you mentioned it in the chapter, but
Sure.
explain to the audience, what is an affinity group?
So basically just organizing around something you enjoy, right? So maybe hiking, maybe it's a book club, and
But
if you don't.
basically, I'm choosing something that I like versus HR or my
Spot
team
on.
leader saying, oh, we get to go for a hike this weekend together.
That's right.
Okay.
Because once you buy into it, right? Obviously, again, going back to what we know about self-determination theory, that sort of buy-in, the fact that you have control, we just know is a more pleasurable experience rather than feeling like it's obligatory, right? And so
Right.
if you're, self-employed or your work doesn't offer that, an amazing website, and again, it's generally accessible to most folks, even if there are smaller areas, is something like meetup.com. But if
Sure.
that's not available, there's other ways to sort of organize, especially if you're an extrovert like me, potentially creating your own group. But why that's important in the construct of trying to have fun at work is that, again, when we are in our immediate cohort, right, with our colleagues or potentially our boss, we're still playing a role, right? Like, there's things that we need to be careful about, especially in today's world. There's new things to navigate, and that are important. So certainly not trying to discredit them. But when you organize around something where you already have this established norm of we all like this, then you don't need to disclose things immediately, right? We know disclosure leads to that social connection, which
Right.
is important. But when you already have a topic that that you all enjoy,
Right.
you can let your hair down, right? I mean,
Yep.
it's kind of plug and play.
I'll give you an example from
Please.
my life that happened this year, because I too am an extrovert. And I'm telling you, the last 3 to 4 years really were I was so used to working on my own and had a great system, and then the system fractured like everybody else.
Yeah.
And I participate in a lot of things in my community. One of them is KNPR, and they have a magazine called Desert Companion. And they do the best of, and they have restaurant awards. And I went to the restaurant awards with one of my clients, and spontaneously, we were having such a good time. We said once a month through 23, we should visit each one of the award winners. And we randomly put together a list. We called it Table of 8, randomly put together a list of like 20 people between us that we knew. And once a month, we've been doing that.
That's amazing.
And what it did for everyone, to the various points, it gave us something around an interest that we had. For me, the interest is in KNPR and seeing their success and the work they do in the community. And I'm all about businesses being successful, so helping restaurants. But then it was the people which added in. So there are ways, and all of the people who attend, and there's different people, although it's called Table of 8. So it's the first 7 reservations that I received, the first 7 yeses. But we all have business or the community in common. And obviously you're willing to eat.
Well, and I think too, I mean, obviously there are a lot of tactics in that chapter, but one that you're alluding to is the fact that it's scheduled too, right? We're busy individuals. And so a lot of times we want to have fun, but it ends up getting deprioritized. And so what you've created is a fairly low barrier, right? Once a month isn't, committing to a once a week book club, which,
Right.
Sometimes for busy parents is just not going to be something that they can integrate, right? Or at least not
Right.
immediately. And then the other is once it's scheduled, it just becomes, what I call immutable, because especially for folks that are living in more of a corporate world, we just see that tool being one that can get use to our advantage, because once something gets on there, it tends to be immutable, right? And so, yeah, I mean, you really set yourself up for success with what you just
Yeah,
described.
and that's interesting to your point, the schedule, because I think that's in and of itself a hidden tip that you're offering all of us. Whether it's mental health, physical fitness, trying to achieve a goal at work, set some sort of a pattern that you're holding yourself accountable to. Because like for us, when we started that, we knew we were going to pick the same day each month. So, but we started out on a Thursday, and a number, like the president of PBS locally, they actually had a meeting on Thursdays, the third Thursday, and somebody else. So we altered it, and then it created a flow, and we have basically not moved off our third Wednesday of every month. And that helps.
Yeah, you bring up a nuanced point that let's sit with for like 30 seconds, and that is, that also creates data, right? So a lot of times when we ritualize something, especially if you're A-type, you're like, no, it's got to be every week, right? Maybe, you know, you had mentioned that I do have a background in fitness. When we look at those, you know, even though we have better science now to suggest that more isn't better and pain doesn't equal gain,
right?
We're just conditioned to believe that we need to ritualize this. And so when it gets on your calendar, sometimes you can be like, you know what, this 1 week cadence wasn't worth it. Let me back off a little bit. And now one time a month is very much doable, but it does require some deliberate thought, because so many people are like, this just isn't working, and don't take that additional step of like, you know, just let me lower the bar, because this is very important for me to get together with my friends. But it's not something I can commit to once a week, but certainly I can commit to it once a month. And folks that do that extra work see it, happen so much more, right?
The other thing I would add to that is give patience to how long it may take you to adjust your schedule. Like, just because you've already got things on the first 2 or 3 meetings doesn't mean you shouldn't go, or doesn't mean you can't do it, but that give yourself a little time to let your schedule open up, like plant that seed, and then it will be amazing how it can get on your calendar.
Yeah, you bring up another great point, and that is, everything in the book is really accessible, right? But what makes it difficult is the equity that you build up does tend to be realized over time. And so when you start these new routines, there's obviously, whatever it is, right? There's going to be these adjustments, and sometimes you're like, but once you do it 2 or 3 times, you realize the value, whether that's something, just like dance classes, on a quote unquote school night that was kind of tough to figure out the first couple of weeks, but by the 3rd or 4th week, you're just laughing joyfully with your partner, and why didn't we do this sooner? But I do see so many folks, right, that first sort of awkwardness of re-entry, and like, and it's like, oh, it's such a shame,
Yep. Now I'll take you back. So you gave us 2 so far. Owning your own time, how important that time affluence. The offering, make sure that the offering strikes at the heart of who's doing it. And what's the 3rd tip?
So it's kind of a continuation of the first, and that is quite explicitly retake your break. So many of us, especially in the hybrid world where we don't really understand when our day starts and ends, can just kind of let the day pass by, right? But and I know we're going to get into it a little bit, but there's such rich science to suggest that if you break up your day, how important that is. It makes it more pleasurable. But I think in the context of the quote unquote fun habit, having that break in the middle of the day is a great way to sort of remove yourself from work and reconnect with friends that are likely also busy. So especially if you're in an environment where you can spend your lunch hour with a friend, those become great opportunities, especially for busy adults where oftentimes the evenings are overscheduled already, right? And so this is specifically for parents, but certainly, can be applied to anyone in general. And so when you do that, whether if you're an introvert and it's just spending time with a good book, whether you're an extrovert like me and it's scheduling, time with folks that you like kind of outside of work, that break really allows us, one, to create another enjoyable opportunity to have fun.
Right.
But then two, really lets us crush the day afterwards.
Right. And I think that that's what this whole fun habit, and this is where I know I started to take my work at the beginning of the year, because I really felt this heaviness in a way that I had never done before. It was as though all the formality of the structures we took for granted broke open, but there wasn't anything really quick to replace it. And there was scattering, and that scattering caused a heaviness. And I felt your book came out in such a beautiful time, because you're giving individuals and corporations the science behind basically why to lighten up and, and then how to lighten up.
Yeah,
That
and
it's not frivolous.
well, certainly, and there's an increasing understanding. It's weird. If you've gotten an MBA at most major MBA programs, you have to read this book called The Goal, and it's really an operational book, but it suggests that when we're the most productive, it's when there's slack in the system. Yet as A-type hard driving individuals, a lot of times, even if we have gaps in our schedule, we'll fill it with busyness, right? But study after study suggests the folks that do that really aren't productive at all, right? I know we're going to get into it. Maybe this is a good sort of segue into the science, but one of the biggest pieces of research that I think is really illuminating is in the field of the hedonic flexibility principle, right? So there's a major piece of research out of MIT, Stanford, and Harvard, huge sample size, right? 28,000 people, and looked at whether or not engaging in pleasure would be infectious, which was kind of the hypothesis, because we're supposed to be pleasure-seeking, creatures, right? Or was there a different story to be told? And so, not surprisingly, folks that are burnt out, right, that just need a reprieve, do seek out poor uses of time, right? Forms of escapism. A lot of times, in the literature, we call it passive leisure, right? And certainly most people know what that is, right? Social media use it, ad nauseum. It's not necessarily consuming television, but plopping down on the couch and surfing Netflix, with no real intent to watch anything, just kind of pacifying time. And when we look back at it, you're not encoding any information. Hey, what did you do last Wednesday? I don't really know. I remember being on the couch, right? And because I always make sure that asterisk, because I think some of the folks that are in my line of research get after media use a little bit more. But if you're watching something like, I remember similar to yourself, scheduling, with 8 friends or 7 friends, watching Lost together because it was, about philosophy, and we all loved it. I wouldn't change that for the world. I don't think that was a poor use of time, because I can remember, every week watching it and then unpacking it, and all the giggles. And so that becomes important, right? Is getting back to the study, that the folks that are burnt out were found to do things like happy hours, plop down on a couch, just weren't finding uses of time that were invigorating. What it did find, surprisingly, is the folks that are kind of deploying this fun habit, right? So are taking breaks, are scheduling time with friends, are finding, respites of self-care throughout the week, are the ones that show up the next day with the vigor and vitality to be the most productive. So ironically, they are the ones crushing the day. But I think an important sort of byproduct of that too is not only are they more productive, but they're also more creative, because when and this well, right? When we're burnt out, we need to rely on our heuristics. And, there can be really smart people that have the algorithms because they're wise, but they can't think out of the box. So, perhaps if you're an accountant where you don't really need, to come up with innovative and creative solutions, it's not the best way to live, but you might still sort of, function effectively throughout the day, because you just do your work and you can rely on those, algorithms.
I wonder if you actually see errors more, like in the accounting example, because I was really inspired by that piece of research that you mentioned in the chapter about creativity, and how, because I know that I was one who, started having coloring books, and in because I was doing far more by myself without the amount of breaks that I was doing, I started, making sure that I colored, even if I felt I was under a time constraint, like I only had this hour to get that written type of thing. I would first start with something which is very out of the box for me. But it caused me to take a break and make me think about colors and whether or not it was going to be in the line or out of the line and all the things. But instead, it opened up my ability to actually sustain longer.
Yeah. And so you and I both learned, we both had the fortunate opportunity to be in Vancouver for this year's IPPA Congress. And,
Yep.
I know that especially when I was getting my PhD, the RAND Corporation came out about some of the early workplace wellness studies and made legitimate claims that there was some data dredging. But I think we now have new science from some of our peers that in earnest lay a better case to suggest that when employees are having fun, enjoying themselves, and really like where they are, it's clear that they're more productive using really sound empirical science.
And I want to say this out loud because we know it. Having fun, and in my case, I say, being silly to be successful doesn't mean you are not highly trained, highly competent, and that you know what you're doing. It is just that you've begun to break away the false structures that made you feel very contained and not doing your best. Is that a fair experience?
No, absolutely. So I think, there's not one thing we can point to, but anyone that sort of understands, maybe has read Duckworth's, work or, has kind of played with ego depletion. I think that story is still emerging, but
right.
If we are constantly working within a negative valence state so that we don't like what we do, then ultimately we are going to burn out. That line is pretty direct, right? It's not a dotted line. We just know that. And so finding ways that you can actually enjoy the things that you're doing, even if you are, a hard driver and you want, an extended workday, that becomes extremely important. So I don't villainize workaholics. I remember this, I think early as a researcher, you really wholeheartedly want to believe like a very explicit hypothesis. We need to, right? So that we defend it. And then right. And so then you get wiser. And so I remember one of those turning points for me was I was interviewing a person that's kind of, made a name for himself in entrepreneurship, Noah Kagan. He owns a company called AppSumo. And he was talking so joyfully, like with this big smile. He was an early employee at Facebook about those hackathons and being with those guys because it wasn't really work, right? Like in the context of what we talk about it. So for anyone that's like, well, I don't want my 45-hour work week to change. I don't care about the research coming out of New Zealand where, as a generality, 4-day work weeks are just as productive and the folks seem to be a lot happier, which makes sense when we look at the research with time affluence, right? But if you don't fall within that normal curve, that's fine. But I still think there's a very strong argument, going back to your point, that if you really don't enjoy what you're doing, ultimately you're going to burn out. And I think, the record levels of burnout we're seeing across all vocations, even after the pandemic, right? 2023 seems to be a horrible year. Academically, I studied physicians the most, and 63%, I think, is the highest we've ever seen for that vocation. And certainly, healthcare workers out of the UK going on strike for the first time, I think, is very telling too this year. So this is something that we need to address. To your point, it's not, kind of whimsical conjecture. It becomes very important in that context because it's not just psychological impact. It's not just poor mental hygiene, right? We know that there's physiological consequences to this as well.
Right. And I think that's where my greatest hope and why I was so attracted to your background. Until we make work and going to work an extension of our well-being and physical fitness versus the thing that makes you unwell and not physically fit, we're not going to meet that intersection, and we have to find that place, because it's where we spend the bulk of our time, and the longer we're living, the more we're doing it. It's like we can't ignore these parts anymore. But I want to make sure we got all 3 tips correct.
That's correct. Yep.
Is there any more science you want to sneak in there?
No, I think we're good. We hit the major ones. I think if you have an interest, the rabbit holes are definitely the hedonic flexibility principle, the concepts of time affluence, and the idea that if you, flex your agency and autonomy, again, that great study about, maybe the last piece of science I would leave in the book, there's this piece of research that suggests that people have a lot more fun working at their desk than going to a fun lunch with their boss if they were told they have to go. And so, just looking through that lens, right, of understanding that, to the extent that you can flex your autonomy,
Right.
will make your work life a lot more enjoyable. It is important to understand. So I think we hit all the bases.
That's terrific. And I want you to know there is one part of you that I really want you to share. Number one, know that I will put a section of your bio where you have the free ebook on the quotes out of your 100 interviews and things like that. Those things that people can help sink into the messages that you gave today. But on that same page, you did something in the art. You set a goal in 2007 that percolated from 2005. And because the science of gratitude is honestly, as far as I'm concerned, the bedrock that shifts positive psychology and the conversation. Tell people what you did in your life, going back that many years, to bring giving and all of that to life in your achievement.
So it came to mind when you were talking about cadence, right? And so when I came up with the idea, it didn't seem that profound, but I think because I've never given up on it, one, it's telling, but 2, has brought a broader interest than I thought. So to get right to it, I mean, it was a simple sort of project. I decided I'd just come out of an entrepreneurial project. I was re-entering the corporate world, so I wanted to make sure that I kept my saw sharp. So I just made a commitment in 2007 that every 3 months I would interview 2 amazing people, so that I was, making sure that I was engaging in that social connection, and then also learning from folks wiser than myself. I was committing to doing at least one thing really interesting or really fun, because I knew if I didn't do that, again, that intentionality might lead to 1 or 2 year stretch of, because I was seeing that with friends. I had my kids a little bit later, but, we knew that we wanted kids, and my friends that had kids had kind of habituated their life in a way that wasn't getting integrated anymore. So I wanted to make sure that didn't happen. And so I set the bar really low too, right? I figured 4 times a year, that's something that should be easily accessible. And then the last part, I wanted to contribute back. So I figured, I wanted some sort of scaffolding for that. I figured I won't, 1 year of my life seemed fairly doable. So, my salary at the time was $65K. So I committed to that. I figured I would eventually.
And I want people, you committed that over this, what was it, a 25-year
25-year period, I'd give 1 year back.
Make sure you gave 1 year of your salary,
right.
Which was, and that's pretty extraordinary.
Oh, I appreciate that. And then 1 year of my time. So
and 1 year of your time.
Yeah. And so I meant not a whole year per se, but one year of work life, which is about 2,000 hours. So, and I've been tracking that. I have a scorecard on my website. So, I think the public commitment is always helpful too, right? So it doesn't just disappear.
Well, why I appreciate that you do this, there is never a time when we cannot set long-term goals. And I had the privilege in one of these conversations recently to interview a 102-year-old who believes she has a 10-year goal.
I love it.
And, because it is the goal that brings her to life, it is not a conversation about whether or not, it's not the outcome so much as striving towards the various pieces. So giving I bet everyone on my channel knows that values in action is a big thing. As you were speaking and the way you created that, clearly curiosity has got to be one of your top strengths. I'd love for you to check that and let me know.
No,
But
I already know. And I
yes,
was amazed. I think I took it the first year Seligman put it out, and to their credit, Penn has still kept that data alive. Yeah,
exactly.
I know he's moved it to something that's more self-branded, but
The BIA Institute, yeah.
yeah, when it was the academic capture of that is still available. So any
Correct.
folks long in the tooth like me, if you're like, I
Yes.
wonder if they still have it, they do. I was quite
They
amazed.
do. They do. Well, Mike, thank you so much. I have to bend down a second and pick up the book that I dropped, but I want to make sure that everyone sees it again. There we go.
Thank you so much for that. I really appreciate it.
And I want to just personally thank you. Every time someone contributes to the work where, the workplace can have the data they need to prove that employees will perform better and will be more satisfied if they do these things. And I believe that that's what your work has done for us.
Thank you so much. That's very kind.
And I'll have lots of things in the links to get back to you and how to get the book. But for now, I am Andrea Goeglein. Thank you so much for joining me, Mike. And make sure you do the work because it does work. Thank you. There we go.